I'm just going to share my screen if I can work out how to do that. We managed to do that before, so here we go. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. As Guy said, I'm going to take a bit of time to run through our COVID-19 journey to share a bit about what we've done, how it's impacted us, what's gone well, what's been hard. And whilst we're all here today from very different organisations, hopefully some of what I've got to share will chime with your own experiences. Certainly for me, putting this talk together has been quite a cathartic experience. Now I'm going to finish by looking ahead with a nod to what we're thinking we might want to take forward from our COVID experiences, particularly as we consider what sort of recovery we want and how we can support sustainable tourism in light of the climate and ecological emergency. And what's reassuring is, having heard from Samantha and Alistair, I don't think I'm going to contradict anything they've said in the next 20 minutes or so. But before that, just to introduce myself to you, I'm Simon Addison, and in language that makes sense, I'm head of finance for the Roman Baths in Bath. I actually started my career not in tourism, but in financial services at the Bank of New York, where I qualified as an accountant, and then saw the light and moved out of financial services to the National Trust, where I had a couple of different roles. And my last role at the Trust was as finance business partner for Dorset, Wiltshire and Somerset. So I had the privilege of visiting the Dorset coast very regularly, and as part of that was involved in a number of the Trust's acquisitions in and around the Golden Cap estate, as well as inland Dorset. Anyway, enough nostalgia. I moved on to my role in Bath in 2017, which is where I've been ever since. And those of you still paying attention will have worked out that I was at an American bank during the credit crunch and in tourism during COVID. So I'm not sure I will be offering anyone any career advice anytime soon. In terms of our operation in Bath, here's a sort of a sense of the scale of our operation. We're about 155 full-time equivalent employees. We're open all year round, and we're one of only a handful of local authority sites to be part of the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions. So we're owned and run by Bath and North East Somerset Council. I'm a council employee, and many councils have outsourced the running of their museum services over the years, but we're still sort of in-house within the council. And we operate the Roman Baths, the Fashion Museum in Bath, the Victoria Art Gallery, Bath Record Office and Bath Film Office. We welcome we did welcome 1.5 million visitors to our sites each year, deliver a profit of around £9 million back to the council, and contribute significantly to the local economy. And I put that in there not really to blow our own trumpet, but to give a sense of the extent to which our fortunes impact the wider local economy. And I'm sure many of you play the same role in the Jurassic Coast setup. You're often the reason that people come, and then whilst they're in the area, that overspill in terms of secondary spend into the wider economy is significant for other organisations. I'm going to concentrate my talk this morning on the Roman Baths, and I'm going to use this chart to sort of plot our way through the last 2 years. And pre-COVID, things were going well, more than well. In fact, we just had our most successful year, coming on the back of a decade of pretty steady growth. The drop in 2012 was due to the Olympics, when everyone in the UK either went to London or Weymouth, but they didn't come to Bath. The sharp growth in 2017 didn't just coincide with my joining the Baths, but was actually a response to the terror attacks in Manchester and in London that year. Visitors perceiving Bath as a smaller, safer destination, accessible without the need for public transport. And actually, that's been a feature of what we've seen over the last little bit of time as well, with people nervous about getting on the tube or getting on trains. Actually, getting to Bath, driving into the city is not good for our sustainability credentials, but has made the Roman Baths feel more accessible to visitors. That growth from 2017 continued, and with the introduction of a new pricing strategy, as well as having our busiest year in 2019, we also had our most profitable year. And for much of the time, Bath and the Roman Baths looked like this. Lots of queues, very diverse audience. We were 40% international, visitors in 2019. And then in late January, I had my first conversation with the CEO of Alva about a virus which might have a small impact on our Chinese visitors over the next couple of months, and we agreed we'd keep in touch on it. That drop in visitors escalated through February, and we started to see European school groups cancelling, etc. And we closed our doors ahead of the national lockdown on the 18th of March, when it just didn't feel safe or responsible to remain open. And we were in an interesting predicament as a local authority attraction. When the government announced a furlough scheme, initially it wasn't available to councils. The business rate relief that was announced also wasn't available to councils, but at the same time, the council relied on the profit that we generated each year to fund its frontline services. So without that certainty of government support, it's fair to say that the March to May 2020 period felt something of a free fall. Nevertheless, as soon as we closed, we sort of started planning for our reopening. And whilst we were closed, we did what we could to maintain brand awareness through that lockdown period. So, we lit the bars blue for Clap for Carers, which got a huge amount of social media attention, and we just tried to remain relevant to our audiences during a time when they couldn't visit. We had a number of media appearances as well. Our slot on Good Morning Britain came on the day that we announced our champagne bar would be running for the summer evenings, and that generated King data. Sadly, my appearance on BBC Breakfast came 3 months after the hairdressers was closed, which was less ideal. And we also did a lot of work through Alva, lobbying DCMS and government in the same way that Alistair described in his talk earlier, particularly around raising support for local authority run attractions, which ultimately did lead to quite a comprehensive package of support coming through in the summer of 2020. In planning our reopening, we used a lot of the sentiment research that was being produced to inform our reopening plans, looking at what sort of measures the public felt would give them the greatest reassurance ahead of opening. And like many of you, I'm sure, we signed up for the government's "We're Good to Go" campaign. Sorry, not government, it was Visit Britain, wasn't it? That sentiment research that I described and our international visitor profile pointed to a pretty challenging reopening for us. Samantha alluded to the public's desire to spend time outside. We have no loyal local market or member base to rely on. We're largely indoors and underground. So we were braced for quite a rocky reopening. And we thought we'd probably be able to reopen at around 30% of our normal capacity, but we actually ended up capping the numbers at 20% because the site just felt busy at that level. And so we operated at or close to that capacity from late July to the end of September. And we actually had our strongest week in 2020 during the October half term, just before we had to close again for the circuit breaker. And we saw a very low level of no-shows. Our secondary spend was strong, both in terms of catering and retail, but we saw a big shift in the emphasis of our retail spend. Pre-COVID, our top selling lines were toiletries, and customers much less confident about picking things up and sniffing them during the pandemic. Our top selling lines in 2020 were actually gin and children's books. So clearly our visitors' homeschooling experiences match my own. Not enough gin and not enough books. Whilst we were open, and it was great to be open, it was a tough environment to be operating in. We actually opened halfway down sort of this steep decline, and our reopening just made ever such a slight dent in the rate at which we were losing visitors compared to pre-pandemic. And we eventually bottomed out at 143,000 visitors as a rolling 12-month total. That's sort of 12% of the pre-pandemic total. And at this point, I sort of thought I'd acknowledge a couple of things that have been particularly tough for our teams. And although we are a 2,000-year-old site, we've done an awful lot of work over the last decade or so to improve our accessibility for wheelchair users, but also for visitors with a range of access needs. We're 90% wheelchair accessible. We've won awards for accessibility, but due to the one-way routes, the positioning of our lifts, we couldn't allow wheelchair users in during standard opening hours. we reserved a 90-minute slot each week for visitors with additional needs. And while some visitors appreciated this, a number got in touch with us to say they felt pigeonholed, or that they weren't able to they weren't able to visit with their friends and family. And for our team, used to receiving positive feedback from these visitors, this was particularly hard. And thankfully, when 2-meter distancing changed to 1 meter plus, we were able to allow wheelchair users back in during our standard opening hours. Other things have been pretty challenging too. Closing the second and third time, operationally easier, we knew what we were doing, but emotionally much harder, and taking a real toll on the resilience of our teams. As I'm sure you guys all found, the ever-changing guidance on rules, when we were wearing masks, when we weren't wearing masks, what the level of distancing was, it was just exhausting to try and keep up with that, and the rate of change and the pace of change there was really difficult. We also realised that our digital content and strategy wasn't as strong as it could have been. We probably had quite an arrogant approach to our online engagement pre-COVID. We were the Roman bars, we were a tick box destination, and so we hadn't really worked hard to build up engaging digital content, and trying to create that during lockdown was really difficult. We couldn't get to site to create new digital media, so that was really difficult. But also there've been some things that have gone really well for us. We've benefited from some additional grant funding. Building on that point that was talked about earlier about experiences and the need to wrap experiences around the visitor offer, we ran our champagne bar through the summer evenings, and sales in both 2020 and 2021 exceeded pre-pandemic levels. The council ran a community hub, and our team, our learning and engagement team, provided craft packs to go out to those families with the food parcels that were going out, and it was a really positive way to serve our local community during this time. During the January our staff vaccination hub in Bath, rather furlough them, there was a real crossover in the core skills of checking that someone arriving at the hub had an appointment for a vaccination, that they knew where they were going, with the role that our front house team would perform day to day. And for our staff, they really appreciated not being furloughed, but feeling like they were positively contributing to the efforts in sort of fighting the pandemic. And for us, when they came back, when we did reopen in May this year, last year now, we're in January, when we reopened in May last year, their skills were sharper than they were after the lockdown when they'd been furloughed. And so it was definitely a win-win for us. But for me, I think the biggest highlight of the last 2 years has been our wedding offer. We've never married more people. We've picked up so much business from couples who maybe would have gone abroad for a wedding, and that was just not possible to do with any confidence. They wanted a venue with character, but for a small ceremony, and the bars delivered that well. But we also picked up business from venues that hadn't handled that cancellation of business so well, and our teams worked really hard to deliver those experiences, and it's been great to sort of facilitate something of such joy during these what's been a very difficult time. Slide to tick on. So looking ahead to the future, my slides have frozen, so they're catching up, apologies. So where are we now? We are just over 300,000 visitors the last 12-month period, and it's great to see our graph to go up. We are still restricting numbers, and that's definitely limiting us at busy times. We were fully sold out between Christmas and New Year, for example, and through January, over half of our revenue comes on a Saturday and a Sunday, but those are the days we're selling out, and I can't fit more people in on those days. And I completely sympathise with Alistair's view that the sort of the lazy opinion that people saw busy beaches and attractions in August and therefore tourism's recovered. It's just such a naive assumption. And we had Nigel Addison, the tourism minister, down with us in the autumn, and I made the point to him that 2 good months doesn't repair the balance sheet following 18 months of a graph like this. Nevertheless, our gap to pre-pandemic is closing. So this chart that hopefully will appear on the screen now shows our 2021 visitor numbers in blue compared to our 2019 visitor numbers in grey, and you can see the gap to pre-pandemic is closing. For November and December, we were above 50% of our 2019 visitor numbers. And we've used yield management and pricing to try and mitigate that shortfall in visitor numbers. We've introduced summer peak pricing, and we have really restricted the number of groups that we've let in. And that has led to a significant increase in the amount of money we have made from each visitor. So this is pre-pandemic in grey, and the dark blue line is the 2020 figures. And then the purple line there shows the 2021 admission figures. And our September 2021 yield was up 37% from pre-pandemic. So when you couple that with the additional spend we've seen in retail, one of the most surprising things about the last 2 years is we've never made more money from the people that we have had in Bath, but obviously the total numbers have been significantly down. But COVID's shown us that people are both prepared to pay for a high quality experience, and I think that was mirrored in the data that Samantha presented earlier. And COVID's also shown us that through the use of time tickets, if people can't get a ticket to come in at 11 o'clock when they want to, they'll book one for 4 p.m. And that points to a different way of managing the site in the future as well. And when we look at our visitor enjoyment scores, sort of that holy grail of visitor experience, of value for money, and net promoter scores have all risen over that time. You can see the 2021 figures at the top, and then the scores for the first COVID year, and then the pre-pandemic benchmarks below. Our net promoter score, which Samantha referred to in her presentation, was at 59 pre-COVID, and it's jumped to 70 over the last 2 years. So our teams have done a really good job at managing a very challenging time and making sure that, yes, we've had masks, yes, we've had distancing, there's been sanitizer everywhere, but it hasn't compromised what has been fundamentally a good visitor experience. And we've been surveying visitors, and they've left us lots of really valuable feedback. And for me, this one is what it's all about. I could have picked any number of comments, but getting kids out from behind their Xboxes, showing them that history and culture can be engaging and accessible for teenagers, has just, that is what it's all about. And more broadly, there's been a sense, particularly through our 2020 reopening, that we had provided that space for reconnection. And I remember seeing a comment from a lady for whom her visit was the first trip out in 4 months. And we'd facilitated a meeting between her and her friend, which represented so much more than a visit to the Roman baths, but a reintroduction and a reconnection with society. And I think that's also borne out of the data that Samantha presented earlier on how people have valued the role that Jurassic Coast has played in their COVID experience. It's been a maelstrom from the chaos of COVID. And our value for money scores rose at a time when we've charged more than we've ever charged before. And lower visitor numbers, it's difficult to say lower visitor numbers equal higher enjoyment scores, but they definitely support our conservation objectives. When our site is busy, visitors bash their bags into the monument, they cause higher levels of wear and tear. And it's not as simple as saying cap the numbers and charge more, because how do we maintain our accessibility to a broad range of socioeconomic backgrounds and avoid becoming a luxury product only accessible to the middle class? But the success of COVID in terms of our spend per visitor and our value for money and our enjoyment and net promoter scores do point to the potential to do things differently as we move forward. It is important to note that 40% of our pre-COVID audience were international, and we can't assume that what has worked well for a domestic audience through COVID will work well for an international audience as they recover. And it's also probably a reasonable assumption that the expectations of a domestic audience will shift as we come out of COVID. But if we simply open everything up that we shut in March 2020, we will have missed such a huge opportunity. And those increased enjoyment scores at a time when we've capped numbers do point to the potential to manage the site differently. And as we go into 2022, we expect to keep our timed admission and our capacity restrictions, hopefully at higher numbers. But we also expect to require groups to pre-book. We're going to seek a recovery that's not reliant on that high volume, low value tourism. Pre-pandemic, so many of our visitors came on coach trips out of London, seeing Windsor, Stonehenge and Bath in a day. That can't be the best way. Well, we know it's not the best way to experience Bath. It means that the broader economic benefits of the visit leave little time for exploration in the city and sort of that secondary spend in other restaurant or accommodation providers. And we know that Bath's World Heritage Site is bigger than the Roman baths. So we're going to seek a recovery that values the longer visit into the city, the overnight stay, and seeing more of what Bath has to offer. And linked to this sustainable recovery, we've started the conversation with some comparable sites to us operating within a World Heritage context. English Heritage in the way that they manage Stonehenge, Edinburgh Castle, and we're looking to engage with the team at the Giant's Causeway, the National Trust team there, because we're all sites who pre-pandemic had visitor business characterised by that high volume tourism, either bought by coaches or cruise ships, or in the case of Edinburgh, both. And I want this conversation to start to shape the national understanding of what we mean by sustainable tourism. We've heard that phrase this morning. It's a phrase used so much, but often to mean different things. And it's encouraging to hear from Samantha that customers are prepared to make choices around sustainability, even if they're not yet ready to pay for it. And what I'm hoping is that by working together with a couple of significant attractions, we can start to build some common understanding and common definitions around that sustainable tourism. Finally, in my time, I'm just going to end with a couple of sort of personal reflections of my last couple of years, and how my job's changed and what it's, the impact it's had on me. And I'm much more comfortable with ambiguity than I was 2 years ago. Scenario planning is far more important in the way that we operate our business at the baths. Preparing for Omicron in mid-December when sort of it all looked like things were going to be heading the wrong direction was such a different experience than March 2020. We just developed a plan for closure, for increased restrictions, for staff absence, and we were ready to deploy them. We had our closure emails written and ready to go. Our social media posts were all saved in draft. When we sat down in March 2020, we just didn't know what to plan for. We've built so much more flexibility into the operating model, around pricing, rotas, opening hours, and we take decisions much later than we used to. Staff comms has never been more important. With that later decision making, there's a risk that staff feel a sense of inaction, and the reality of the last 2 years has been that a lot of decisions have been taken by a very small number of people at the top of the organisation, and ensuring good communication and cascade of that. Why we've taken the decisions, what decisions we're planning to take and when we're planning to take them has been essential so that staff feel supported and feel like they know what's going on. We need to develop greater clarity on what success looks like. Pre-COVID, we sort of bumbled along, which is an odd thing to say for such a large attraction. But the scale of the operations at the bars meant that we knew what we were doing and we were a big ship to turn. So changes were introduced slowly. And through this period, I've often asked, why are we doing that? Or what's the objective here? And the answer, we've always done it that way, isn't good enough. We need to be intentional about our activity, particularly as we reopen and we recover, so that we know what we're trying to achieve. If we want fewer visitors at our busiest times, we need to make sure that all of our marketing money isn't spent on the summer campaign. And that's just one illustration, but there are so many other areas where we need all of our activity to be pulling together to the same objectives, and that's just not been the case in all areas of our business. I think I definitely underestimated the impact that we had on other businesses in and around Bath. for many of you, as I said before, you'll be the reason that people come to the Jurassic Coast. And when we reopened the baths in 2020, we had a lot of people come to us and say, we're so glad you've opened. It's given us the confidence to do the same, or it's stimulated business that we didn't think we were going to get. So don't underestimate the positive impact on local business of your own activity. And finally, it's so easy to write, isn't it? And so hard to do, but trying not to let work be all consuming. There were definitely times in the last year, 2 years, when I felt like I was failing at everything, and not doing enough at work to contribute to our survival and recovery, not doing enough to support family at home, and it's so easy to lose that perspective. And reading that first tranche of visitor feedback in early August 2020 was a really emotional moment for me. I'd lost that sense of what we were achieving through being open, in all the conversations we've been having about how many people you can fit into a toilet. So thank you very much for listening. I hope some of this has resonated with you. It's very difficult to know how to pitch a talk for such a diverse set of organisations, but hopefully some useful bits in there, and really happy to take any questions that you might have. Thanks very much.
Simon, absolutely brilliant. It's always just fascinating to hear what sort of other organisations are doing. It's always just really, really useful. So I'm sure everyone else found it as interesting as I did. Alistair, you had a question.
Yeah, I thought that was absolutely brilliant, and it showed how businesses are having to change the way they operate, and actually some of the way that they change operate is actually an improvement on the visitor experience. We were always told when we went down to Cornwall with the kids years ago, you could buy Eden project tickets in any post office. That was a great asset that they had, was that, buy the 9 o'clock ticket, because if you got there at 9 o'clock, it would be empty. It was a really crude way of doing it, rather than at lunchtime. The online booking that we all have access to now for our businesses really does mean that you can level out that visitor experience and not have peaks and troughs. And visitors are much more used to it as a consequence of the last couple of years. So I would spread that into restaurants. Restaurants have had a real problem, particularly during the pandemic, when they have opened, of guests booking multiple restaurants and only turning up to one. I know it's hard to believe that people would behave like that, but they do in their scores. So it's going to be quite likely that we'll all have to book and pay a deposit for our restaurant. And that's fine. If I'm saying I want to book my beloved Rusty Pig or Holt on a Friday night, I'm absolutely prepared to make that commitment. And so, there are going to be changes like that, which will ultimately also improve the guest experience as well as the operating procedures for the visitors. Self-catering businesses have been having guests using the swimming pools on exclusive rota bases. And that was a COVID measure for many. And 90% of them are going to keep that because it's a better visitor experience that they don't share the pool where that's possible. So there are hundreds of these wonderful changes that people are doing that actually will stay. And that's what I was said at the beginning. And I think that the Roman baths have done that in spades. And also the impact that you have on the local economy. I'm really pleased you picked that up. That was a huge omission from what I said. If the shortage of labour and the short opening of pubs and restaurants, which we're suffering, continues long term, that means that the people won't come down out of season and won't come down out of weekends, which will have a knock-on effect not only for the wider visitor economy, but for communities, because those assets are also community assets. Those pubs, those restaurants only being open for a couple of days, or perhaps not opening in the winter, is a loss to the community. So this is how incredibly intertwined the whole thing is, and I'm sure that every business in Bath is delighted at your reopening. So that was a brilliant presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair. That's great. Simon, just had a question from Sarah Philbrick, one of our lovely trustees. Given your different approach to visitors, so the higher value and lower volume, how do you maintain commitment to being inclusive and affordable?
That's a great question, and it's not an easy one to answer. I wish I had a perfect sentence to that. One of the things that I introduced in 2019 was a variable pricing structure, which gives visitors a choice between time and price. So our price fluctuates by up to 35% during the year. So if someone, if prices are an issue for people, then we are cheaper out of season than we are in the summer. But it's still an expensive product, and I don't have the perfect answer. Developing meaningful relationships with community groups, genuinely to those to reach communities, important, because lowering the price and then selling that cheaper ticket to a Chinese or American tourist does nothing to increase that accessibility. So working with schools is a big thing for us. Every child has to go to school, whatever their socio-economic background. So making sure that our education offer is priced really affordably, and using that summer tourist business to subsidize the education offer is probably our single biggest route into that. But and I want to do more to look at how we can offer promotions for children who've come on school visits to return with their families. But there are rules about marketing through children, so we have to tread that line really carefully. But the child who gets enthused on a school visit and goes home and tells their parents, look, the bars wasn't full of tourists, or it was full of tourists, but it's also for people like us, is something that I need to do more work on. But it's a challenge the national museums have when they're free to enter. If you look at the Natural History Museum, it's still dominated by AB1 demographics. So it's not just price. It's got to be making sure that your front door feels something that people are comfortable to walk through. And we're really mindful of the work we've got to do in that area.
Great, thank you, Simon. That's brilliant. Okay, don't think we've got any more questions there. So